What does it look like when a nuclear superpower begins to fail, not at the borders, but in its own streets? Imagine a winter night stretching from Moscow to the Urals. Streetlights flicker, emergency phones ring unanswered, hospitals ration heat, trains slow, then stop. Nothing explodes. No coup is announced. Yet something fundamental breaks. The system that once projected strength through fear and control starts to hollow out from within. This is not collapse by invasion, it is collapse by exhaustion. For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin constructed what he called a vertical of power. Courts, police, intelligence services, and regional governors were bound tightly to the Kremlin. Order was enforced, dissent was crushed early. In exchange, the population received stability, predictable wages, functioning infrastructure, and the promise that chaos belonged to the 1990s, not the present. That bargain defined modern Russia. By late 2025, that bargain is unraveling, not because of a single dramatic event, but because multiple internal systems are failing at once. Analysts cited by independent Russian and international observers describe a state no longer able to perform its most basic duties. Law enforcement is depleted, healthcare is breaking under coercion, transport networks are drowning in debt. The war in Ukraine, meant to restore imperial prestige, has instead redirected resources away from the home front at a pace the state cannot sustain. This is the first and most dangerous phase of state failure and visibility. Shops still open, flags still fly, television still declares strength, but behind the facade, the machinery that keeps daily life functioning is seizing up. Empires rarely collapse the way movies depict them. They collapse when teachers leave, when doctors quit, when police stop answering calls. History shows this pattern repeatedly, from late Soviet stagnation to more recent Middle Eastern state failures. The Kremlin's strategic focus remains outward. Ukraine dominates military planning. NATO dominates rhetoric. The West dominates propaganda. Yet the most critical battlefield now lies inside Russia itself. The war economy has consumed manpower, money, and political attention, leaving domestic institutions understaffed and underfunded. The result is not immediate rebellion, but something more corrosive, quiet withdrawal. Security services that once symbolized omnipresence are thinning. Civil servants are disengaging. Regional administrators are improvising survival strategies independent of Moscow. This decentralization is not reform, it is drift, and drift in authoritarian systems is lethal. What makes this moment especially volatile is timing. Unlike previous crises, Russia is facing internal decay while simultaneously under maximum external pressure sanctions, military attrition, diplomatic isolation, and now accelerated peace timelines pushed by Washington under President Donald Trump. The margin for error has vanished. Every internal weakness now intersects with global scrutiny. This section marks the beginning of the story, the cracking of the fortress. Not through protest crowds or palace coups, but through systemic fatigue. The Kremlin still commands fear, but fear alone cannot staff hospitals, run railways, or patrol streets. When the foundations erode, power becomes performative, and performative power does not last. A police state depends on one non-negotiable assumption: when citizens call for help, someone arrives. In Russia, that assumption is failing. Across vast regions, police stations remain staffed in name only. Desks are empty. Patrols are thin or non-existent. This is not rumor or isolated anecdote. It is a structural withdrawal of law enforcement capacity that strikes at the core of state authority. According to multiple analyses referenced by independent monitoring groups, Russia's Ministry of Internal Affairs faces a personnel shortfall approaching 200,000 officers. In remote districts east of the Urals and across parts of the North Caucasus, operational capacity has fallen to levels more consistent with failed states than industrial powers. In some rural zones, vacancy rates approach 90%. The implication is stark. For millions of citizens, the state no longer enforces order. Low pay explains only part of this exodus. A police officer earns a fraction of what a contract soldier receives at the front, but money alone does not cause systemic flight. Fear does. Investigators, prison officials, and senior officers increasingly believe that accountability is coming from war crimes, inquiries from internal purges, or from a post-war reckoning they may not survive. Some have already defected, others have simply vanished from service. Files disappear, testimony travels west. When enforcement collapses, power does not vanish, it fractures. Local communities, ethnic minorities, migrant groups, and regional elites begin to self-organize. Weapons circulate freely. Millions of illegal firearms, many brought home by traumatized veterans from Ukraine, now exist outside state control. This is not organized rebellion, it is privatized security. Regional governors hire private protection, business owners form armed networks, villages rely on informal militias. In several documented incidents, police units have retreated when confronted by armed civilians. The message spreads quickly the state will not intervene, and once that realization sets in the monopoly on violence, the defining feature of sovereignty is lost. This shift carries enormous strategic consequences. Authoritarian systems rely on predictability. Citizens may resent repression, but they understand the rules. When enforcement becomes inconsistent, fear mutates into uncertainty. Uncertainty breeds risk-taking. Crime rises. Ethnic tensions sharpen. Loyalty erodes. For the Kremlin, this creates an impossible dilemma. Redeploy forces inward and the front lines weaken. Maintain focus on Ukraine and domestic order decays further. There are not enough loyal trained personnel to do both. The Russian state is discovering the same truth that overstretched empires always face security abroad consumes security at home. The symbolism matters as much as the reality. A regime that built its legitimacy on order can survive corruption, inequality, even military defeat. What it cannot survive is the perception that it no longer controls the streets. Once that belief takes hold, power drains rapidly, often without a single shot being fired. When soldiers march, something else stands still. In Russia, that something is healthcare transport and the civilian systems that keep a nation alive in wartime. As the police thin out hospitals and railways are now showing parallel signs of breakdown less visible than street crime, but far more dangerous over time. Russia entered the war in Ukraine with an aging medical system already strained by demographics and underinvestment. By late 2025, that system is being held together by coercion rather than consent. Faced with a severe shortage of doctors, the Kremlin has imposed mandatory service requirements on medical graduates, effectively binding them to remote, under-resourced regions for years at a time. No housing guarantees, no competitive wages, no security. The message is simple: serve where ordered or lose your profession. The result is predictable. Young doctors are abandoning medicine altogether or leaving the country. Others comply formally while disengaging mentally, doing the minimum required to avoid punishment. This is not resilience. It is burnout institutionalized. Healthcare systems do not fail dramatically. They fail quietly through misdiagnoses, delayed treatment, and exhausted staff. The casualties appear slowly, one patient at a time. The railways tell a similar story on a national scale. Russia's vast geography makes rail transport not just an economic asset, but a strategic artery. Military logistics, food distribution, industrial supply chains all depend on functioning rail lines. Yet Russian Railways, one of the country's largest employers, is buried under trillions of rubles in debt. Freight volumes have fallen sharply under sanctions and wartime disruption. Maintenance is deferred. Wages are delayed. 700,000 railway workers represent more than an industry. They are a pressure point. If morale collapses or strikes spread, the consequences extend far beyond economics. Tanks stall. Food shortages emerge. Urban centers feel the shock within days. The Kremlin understands this risk, which is why it has so far relied on intimidation rather than reform to keep trains moving. These failures share a common cause: the war economy's zero-sum logic. Resources diverted to weapons production, mobilization, and internal surveillance are resources not spent on infrastructure or human capital. Engineers fix missiles instead of heating systems. Steel reinforces armored vehicles instead of pipelines. The choice is deliberate and increasingly unsustainable. This erosion also reveals a deeper strategic flaw. Modern power is not measured solely by military output, but by system integration. States that cannot maintain healthcare and transport under stress lose long-term conflict endurance. Ukraine has demonstrated this principle through decentralized resilience. Russia, by contrast, has doubled down on centralized extraction. The human impact is immediate and corrosive. Delayed care turns survivable illnesses fatal. Transport failures isolate regions. Public trust dissolves. People adapt individually, hoarding, relocating, bribing, while collective capacity shrinks. Over time, this creates a society optimized for survival, not productivity. History is unforgiving to regimes that sacrifice civilian systems for prolonged war. Once doctors and railway workers disengage, recovery takes years, not months. And in Russia's case, those years may no longer be available. When a state can no longer generate wealth, it begins to extract it by force. In Russia, that phase has arrived. Taxes rise, wages stagnate, consumption falls, and even the most protected workers, those at the heart of the energy sector, are no longer immune. The Kremlin's decision to raise the value-added tax to 22% is not a policy choice rooted in reform. It is an emergency measure. VAT hits everyone from pensioners buying bread to families purchasing winter clothes. Unlike corporate taxes, it cannot be hidden or deferred. It is the clearest signal that traditional revenue streams, oil, gas exports, are no longer sufficient to fund the state's obligations. At the same time, living standards are visibly declining. Independent economic data shows reduced consumption of basic food staples. Milk, meat, rice items that define daily stability are quietly disappearing from shopping baskets. Inflation erodes savings. Workers are pressured into voluntary wage contributions to support the war effort. The social contract is no longer implicit. It is being enforced through guilt and coercion. The most alarming development lies in the energy sector. Oil workers have long occupied a privileged position in Russian society. Their wages were reliable. Their labor funded the state. Their loyalty was assumed. That assumption is now in doubt. Reports of delayed or missing salaries in key oil regions represent a strategic red line. If the men who extract the resource that sustains the war are not paid, the illusion of control collapses. Unpaid oil workers do not protest symbolically. They shut valves. They strike. And when they do, the consequences cascade across the entire system, from fuel shortages to budget shortfalls. This is not merely an economic dispute. It is a threat to national solvency. The Kremlin's response has been improvisation rather than strategy. Budget gaps are patched with borrowing. Debt accumulates. Inflation accelerates. Meanwhile, mortgage rates soar beyond affordability, freezing the construction sector and trapping families in financial limbo. Apartments promised remain unfinished. Developers edge toward bankruptcy. A generation discovers it has debt but no future asset to show for it. These pressures converge into something far more dangerous than protest disengagement. People stop planning, stop investing, stop believing. When citizens no longer expect the future to improve, compliance weakens. Fear still exists, but it no longer motivates productivity. Economically, Russia now faces a paradox. War sustains certain industries while destroying the broader market that supports them. Peace would end emergency spending and expose mass unemployment. Continued war accelerates inflation and debt. There is no painless exit. History shows that regimes can survive poverty. They can survive inequality. What they struggle to survive is bankruptcy combined with broken trust. As the state reaches deeper into private life to fund its survival, it confirms what many already sense: the system is consuming itself to stay alive. Economic collapse rarely arrives alone. It brings social consequences that linger long after budgets are rewritten and wars end. In Russia, those consequences are now emerging in the streets, workplaces, and neighborhoods where the state's attempt to survive is quietly destabilizing the society it claims to protect. The return of veterans from Ukraine was meant to be framed as a triumph. Instead, it has become a security dilemma. Tens of thousands of men are coming home from a war marked by extreme violence, minimal psychological support, and deliberate recruitment from prisons. Many return with trauma, some return with weapons, others return with a belief that the rules no longer apply to them. Crime statistics linked to returning soldiers are rising, and local authorities are struggling to respond. This problem is magnified by the earlier collapse of law enforcement. When police presence is weak or absent, violence fills the vacuum. Communities learn quickly that help may not arrive. Domestic disputes escalate. Organized crime reasserts itself. Informal justice spreads. The designation of war veterans as a new elite further complicates. Enforcement officers hesitate to confront men celebrated by state media even when crimes occur. At the same time, the Kremlin is attempting to solve its labor crisis through demographic substitution. With millions of working-age Russian men mobilized, wounded, or dead, the government has opened the door to large-scale foreign labor imports, particularly from South Asia. Official statements describe this as economic necessity. Social reality tells a different story. Russia remains a deeply nationalistic society, conditioned for years to view outsiders with suspicion. Introducing vast numbers of foreign workers into an environment already strained by unemployment, housing shortages, and cultural resentment is a volatile experiment. Competition for jobs intensifies. Ethnic tensions rise. The social fabric thins. This strategy also exposes the failure of the ideological project known as the Russian world. A vision built on ethnic unity and cultural continuity is now being sustained sustained by imported labor and emergency measures. Survival has replaced identity as the organizing principle of the state. Meanwhile, younger generations are quietly opting out. Students avoid professions tied to coercion. Skilled workers emigrate when possible. Those who remain lower expectations and disengage from civic life. This is not rebellion, it is attrition. Societies can endure hardship, but they cannot endure the steady loss of purpose. The long-term danger is normalization. Violence, scarcity, and insecurity become routine. When dysfunction becomes familiar, outrage fades. That is when collapse accelerates, not because people rise up, but because they stop caring whether the system survives. Russia now faces a social equation with no easy solution. Repression deepens resentment. Reform risks exposure. Immigration fills jobs but fuels division. Veterans demand respect but bring instability. Each short-term fix creates a longer-term fracture. This is what internal unraveling looks like, not one crisis, but many intersecting pressures pushing society toward fragmentation. As Russia's internal systems strain, the external clock is ticking faster. Geopolitics is no longer a distant abstraction. It is closing in on Moscow's shrinking room for maneuver. Under President Donald Trump, Washington has accelerated efforts to impose a decisive timeline on the war in Ukraine, pressing for negotiations that would freeze the conflict before another winter drains Western patience and Ukrainian manpower. On paper, such pressure might appear to benefit the Kremlin. In reality, it exposes Russia's deepest vulnerability. The Russian economy is now trapped between two incompatible futures. Continued war sustains defense factories and absorbs unemployment, but it deepens inflation, debt, and infrastructure decay. Peace, by contrast, would abruptly end emergency spending, return hundreds of thousands of soldiers to a job market that cannot absorb them, and strip the regime of its primary justification for repression. War and peace are no longer strategic choices, they are mutually destructive outcomes. This dilemma is not unique to Russia. Ukraine faces similar post-war reintegration risks. Israel confronts internal strain under prolonged mobilization. Iran balances external confrontation against domestic unrest. Even the United States, locked in strategic competition with China, grapples with how global power projection affects internal cohesion. But Russia's position is uniquely precarious because its institutions were never designed for adaptability. They were designed for control. Internationally, Russia's leverage is thinning. Transit restrictions imposed by neighboring states limit access to critical components. Sanctions bite deeper into technology and finance. Diplomatic isolation reduces bargaining power. The Kremlin once relied on time as a weapon, outlasting opponents through endurance. That strategy falters when internal decay moves faster than external pressure. The war has also diminished Russia's symbolic prestige. A superpower that cannot keep its cities warm, pay its oil workers, or staff its police stations loses credibility abroad. Allies hedge, neutrals distance themselves, rivals wait. Power projection depends as much on perception as on capability, and perception is shifting. This moment forces a fundamental question. What happens when a state optimized for coercion can no longer coerce effectively? The answer is rarely orderly transition. More often, it is stagnation followed by sudden rupture. History offers no comfort here. Systems that refuse reform until collapse rarely control the terms of their own survival. Russia's crisis is not defined by one leader or one war. It is defined by imbalance between ambition and capacity, control and consent force and legitimacy. The choices made in the coming months will not determine whether Russia wins or loses a war. They will determine whether the state itself can endure. And that leaves the world with an unsettling uncertainty when a nuclear power loses internal coherence. Who manages the consequences? Russia's crisis in late 2025 is not a single collapse, but a convergence of failures. Law enforcement shortages undermine public order. Healthcare and rail systems decay under coercion and debt. Economic pressure shifts from production to extraction, eroding trust and living standards. Veterans return to a society unable to absorb them, while imported labor strains an already fractured social fabric. All of this unfolds as external pressure accelerates, forcing decisions the system is not built to make. This story is not about dramatic overthrow, it is about systemic exhaustion. Authoritarian power relies on functioning institutions, not just fear. When those institutions hollow out control, becomes symbolic. The Kremlin now faces an impossible balance: continue a war it cannot afford or accept a peace it cannot manage. Globally, the implications extend beyond Russia. A destabilized nuclear state challenges assumptions about security, deterrence, and international order. The question is no longer whether pressure will change change Moscow's behavior, but whether internal decay will outpace any diplomatic solution. As history has shown, the most dangerous phase of decline is not collapse itself, but the moment when a system can no longer decide which path leads to survival.